Today we're going to dig into sort of a solution-oriented definition of depression, strategies for engaging that definition, and how it can actually provide hope in the midst of a culture that often oppresses the depressed with myths of pathology which sabotage the very possibility of recovery. It is common in the 21st century to romanticize depression in an attempt to remove any sense of guilt among the depressed for depression. Evangelical dialogue, particularly about depression, has largely adopted a pathological conception of the experience following the psychiatric conception and the psychological conception of the phenomenon, of course. And this conception isn't altogether wrong-headed, although the possibility for a solution to depression seems to have been obscured by the acceptability of the condition. And here we will unpack specifically how to understand depression through a solution-focused lens, and thereby to reconceive the very nature of the condition's grasp on the mind. Depression is often one of two kinds of depression, or a mixture of these two kinds. And a failure to distinguish between these two kinds will yield frustration and will impede progress in overcoming depression. And these two kinds of depression are situational depression and dispositional depression. But before we unpack this distinction, we should make another simpler distinction first, that between pathology and dynamism. Now, pathology is the aspect of a psychological state which is passively experienced by a person. It is the portion of their experience over which they do not have direct operational control. That's pathology. The aspect or the portion of their experience over which they do not have direct operational control. Dynamism is the aspect of a psychological state which actively expresses one's inner state over which one has direct operational control. So pathology, I don't have operational control over what's happening to me. Dynamism, I do. So now breaking down into situational depression and dispositional depression. Let's start with dispositional depression. What is dispositional depression? Depression could be a pessimistic disposition that latches onto anything that it can to fabricate its own credibility. So dispositional depression is pathological insofar as it is the result of physiological and psychological conditions. If one has cultivated one's appetites to enjoy self-destructive objects, or one has indulged their pessimism so often and so habitually, well, depression is a natural result. Depression can be the consequential inability to make positive sense or proactive momentum out of anything in one's life. Now, dispositional depression can be not just pathological, but dynamic and active to the degree that one continues to participate in those same psychological habits which yielded the depression to begin with. Examples of this include unrestrained indulgence in overeating and pornography use, and anger and cynicism, resentment, physical inactivity, social isolation. All of these things can be active products of my will, which produce a pathological and dispositional depression. So dispositional depression can be pathological and dynamic in those ways. Then there is situational depression, and very often depression is about something. And we really don't like talking about the fact that depression could possibly be about something, right? Because while we want to sort of correct a very old and I think not even popularly adopted anymore kind of fundamentalist suspicion towards psychiatric medication, and I think we could actually use a continued suspicion towards psychiatric medication, but we are hesitant to speak of depression as about something because we don't like thinking of or speaking about depression in terms of quick fixes. The problem is we've gone so far in the other direction and emphasized its dispositionality and its pathological quality that we have lost sight of the possibility of any hope for overcoming depression at all. So it's important to recognize that depression isn't just dispositional. Depression isn't just about your serotonin levels. Depression isn't just pathological. Depression can be situational and, in that sense, meaningful. There's actually something meaningful about the depression. It's actually communicating something. It's contentful. So, in a psychologized evangelical culture, many Christians are reluctant to speak about depression in this way, about situational depression, that is, depression being about something, because Christians are reluctant to speak about it this way because they don't want to make the solution to such a besetting problem sound so simple, even though evangelicals have certainly been culpable of this before. And because of this rhetoric that is so anti-solution with regard to depression, that's so anti-overcoming depression, it's very easy to believe that depression is commonly about nothing at all, that it is merely pathological and dispositional and sporadic and spontaneous and has no content at all. That's the common evangelical conception of depression, that it's as meaningful as a broken leg. But that simply does not account for the phenomenon of depression per se. So, situational depression is pathological insofar as it is a result of external conditions. And so situational depression is pathological to the degree that it is in response to unforeseen tragic circumstances, for example, such as injury or death or broken relationships. Situational depression is dynamic and active insofar as one is living in the bed that one has made for oneself. And situational depression is active to the degree that one is living the life one has created through one's own bad choices. Okay, so there are pathological and dynamic aspects to dispositional depression and situational depression. And now we will move to this one question, which often receives odd answers, and I think will guide us in the task of attempting to conceive of hopefulness for the depressed. And it's this question: is it okay to be depressed? Is it okay to be depressed? And with this distinction in hand, I want to make a claim that really shouldn't be bold, but will be taken as, people will hear this. I know for a fact. I've been in these conversations about Christianity and mental health for a long time. I was a research assistant and marketing on the marketing team at CCEF for a long time, and I've been in these conversations for about 7 or 8 years now, okay? And what I'm about to say will be taken as offensive and victim-blaming and unempathetic and uninformed and ignorant, and it is none of those things. It is quite the opposite of all of those things. But in order to state this claim as simple as possible, I will put it in the form of this question I've just raised. Again, here's the question: is it okay to be depressed? The answer is no. No, it is not okay to be depressed. It sounds very harsh to suggest that the depressed person bears some responsibility for their state. Because again, we're so used to emphasizing and really exhaustively conceiving of depression in a pathological way. It sounds harsh to suggest that a depressed person should just snap out of it or get out of it. But the truth is quite the opposite. It is not harsh to say these things, because we have so pathologized our conception of depression that we have actually robbed depressed people of a way of thinking about their condition that empowers them to think of a way out. So let me pose a different question, okay? I already asked the question, is it okay to be depressed? And I've answered no. Here's another way of getting at the issue, another question we might ask. Is it good to be depressed? It might be fitting to be sad in response to a tragedy, right? But even grief, which is different than depression, even grief is most successful when it is accomplished most quickly. Recent psychological science bears this out. Late 90s grief theory with the 5 stages with Kubler-Ross and all that stuff recommended that people take longer to grieve and in order to achieve a more successful resolution to the grief, almost to the point where grief theorists were suggesting that the longer you grieve, the more resolution you have, the better the process. It is. But recent research in resilience, it's not so recent anymore, it's about 15 years old, but the latest resilience research and really the latest scientific consensus among psychologists, particularly spearheaded by a psychologist at the University of Columbia, George Bonanno, or Columbia University, Bonanno has shown that the quickest pass through grief and those which demonstrate the greatest resilience to sadness are the most effective and formidable solutions to grief. So we used to think that wallowing in sadness kind of purchased something for us in terms of grief resolution, but it turns out that the opposite is true. That wallowing in our sadness and taking a luxurious amount of time through our grief process actually only digs us deeper into a pathological hole from which we will have to dig ourselves out. And more than that, there are externalities to depression, especially if you are married or have children. A lot of people who want to pathologize depression are really young single Christians that they don't perceive, or maybe they don't even have externalities for their depression that are very serious. So not only can you escape depression, which you absolutely can, it is incumbent upon you to do so. It is incumbent upon you to do so. It is your ethical duty to overcome depression if you have it, especially if you are a meaningful participant in society. And that's not a judgment, that is not a per se condemnation of you. It is a valuation of your dignity and your worth and its needfulness to be rescued from the pit of depression, which is an evil consequence of the fall that many of us have to face. And the script that you've probably received from the Christian community will tell you it's impossible, and that you cannot overcome your depression, and that it's so normal and it's so insurmountable that you should just accept depression as your new life and your new state of mind, and not to feel guilty about it. Well, if you have accepted that script, you should feel guilty for accepting that script, because it's ethically irresponsible. Because that script is evil and it's harmful to you, and to the extent that it persuades you not to try to escape depression or hampers the energy with which you seek to escape your condition, it is an evil script, and the people who perpetuate it are perpetuating harm to you and to your loved ones. Even if you're not married and you don't have children, you still owe it to yourself to fix yourself. When somebody says, "Oh, you can't overcome depression. It's not something you can overcome. It's just a condition. It's a lifelong thing." Yada yada yada. That's okay. Maybe they've needed to tell themselves that for some reason, but you don't have to tell yourself that, because it's a lie. It's not a universal human truth. People overcome this stuff all the time. It's not easy, it's not overnight, but there are paths to take dispositionally and situationally with regard to your pathology and your dynamism. And once you understand what's going on, you can have a solution-oriented, strategically informed approach to your depression that pulls you out of it. You can do it. And the blame for failing to do it may not rest on a failure of willpower on your part as much as it rests on a script you've adopted from credible mental health authorities who are culpable for perpetuating false and entrapping speech, which has decimated your efforts before you have even had a chance to try to get out of it. And you can get out of it. And this is the hope for the depressed. The first message of hope that every depressed person needs to hear is that it's not good to be depressed, and you can absolutely get out of it. And the treatment plan for each person will depend on what unique cyclone of situational and dispositional depression prompted the onset of their psychological darkness. Situational depression can easily cultivate a dispositional depression, which will fortify itself by growing physiological and psychological pathologies in the depressed person, which further perpetuate the dispositional depression. This deepening dispositional depression will hinder the depressed person from overcoming external situational factors, contributing to situational depression, fortifying even further the dispositional depression. You see how that cyclone works? It is a cycle that drags many people down to hell for their entire lives, and it drags nearly 100,000 people 100,000 Americans each year to kill themselves. The two most important causes, or the two most common causes of depression, are social isolation and unemployment. And if you can rectify these two realities in your life, that will not immediately cure your depression, but it is one of the most effective ways to condition yourself out of a depressive disposition and into a fortuitous relational and financial situation. And the primary means by which people find their way out of financial duress is by being enmeshed in a community with people who can connect them with not just employment opportunities, but meaningful work which dignify their capacity to create and contribute to society. In other words, making them socially valuable. If you are depressed, it is most likely the natural feeling produced in your mind by social isolation and financial dispossession, or combined in a single concept, a feeling of social worthlessness. The greater degree to which you are able to rectify these two realities in your life, or to increase your sense of social value and the reality of your social value, then the more quick and lasting the tentacles of situational and dispositional depression will unravel from your neck. The more socially connected you are with intimate friends who live close to you, and the more you are able to secure a steady income, the more you will be able to use your dynamic faculties, including your mind and will and appetites and affections and imagination. The more you will be able to use your dynamic faculties of mind and will to overcome the weakening pathological elements of depression. Start with the tactic, okay? Start with what is tactile to you. Trust that whatever you're feeling right now is a natural response to a situation that needs to be fixed. And fix that situation. And then with your new situational liberty, you can change your habits and actions to objects which facilitate a positive mindset rather than a negative one. You are literally digging yourself out of a hole. And the more you socially integrate and gain financial stability, the easier this will feel. When you begin digging yourself out, it will feel impossible. Today will be the hardest day. Getting yourself out of a depressive state is a lot like getting in shape physically. Honestly, it's very hard. It takes a lot of effort, and the results take a lot of time to manifest themselves noticeably. But there really is only one way, and you must pursue that way. Can medication and, like SSRIs, can they be helpful? Absolutely. You should use whatever tools you can possibly find that will help. Of course, you should consider medication. You should seriously consider that path, especially if you're severely depressed. There is nothing inferior or wrong about taking medicine. Nothing. And you should also consider what personal goals you want to maintain with the mental strength you will gain from that medication. So think, okay, can I take medication? Absolutely. You should seriously consider it, especially if you're in a severe state of mental suffering. But also ask yourself, what will I do with the mental strength, with the benefits I gain from this medication? If your goal with medication is to be a happy, isolated, inactive, indulgent, unproductive person, you will fail, and medication will fail you, because you can't cure meaninglessness with medication. You must always keep your eye on the primary goal in overcoming depression, which is to socially integrate yourself with positive-minded people who are able to empathize and be patient with your journey out of depression and to establish financial stability. I cannot stress how important these variables are in overcoming depression. They are extremely important. Overcoming financial instability is as important as considering medication. It is at least as important. People who accomplish these things, social integration and financial stability and prosperity, they rarely become depressed. It's only acceptable to be depressed if you have no meaning in your life. You're not guilty of sin because of depression, but you are responsible for getting out of the mindset. And it's something you should seek to do as soon as possible. Okay, progressive evangelicals especially will often romanticize depression. They kind of we're like the people who care about mental illness and stuff like that, but they do progressive evangelicals, the kind of liberal-leaning, left-leaning evangelicals, they're so bad at psychology. It would be laughable if it didn't have such grave consequences. So progressive evangelicals they romanticize people who are depressed just like they romanticize every other victim card that they try to stuff in their pocket. Okay, and they use mental illness as a soft filler for an intersectionality card. It's like the white intersectionality card is mental illness, right? And that's how depression plays itself out in among progressive evangelicals, and it's really uninformed and poorly read and poorly conceived, and really an abuse of the concept. So progressive evangelicals, they romanticize this concept, but they don't really know how to think about it well. So they buy this sort of modern psychiatric dogma about the pure pathology of mental suffering, but it's really uninformed. It's not even up to date, right? If you read the latest research on bibliotherapy by David Burns, or read the latest resilience research by George Benano, you'll see this whole romanticization of depression is quite harmful, quite harmful. Depression can literally kill you. So this whole, it's okay to be depressed. No, it's not. You should fix it immediately. Okay, suicide rates. We think that we're helping by destigmatizing mental illness, right? And mental illness is a different conversation altogether. But depression, particularly mild to moderate depression, and severe depression. These are three different kinds of depression that require three different treatments, right? Depression can literally kill you. So even though we've destigmatized depression socially, suicide rates are still skyrocketing, which means whatever we're doing is having an inverse effect. And part of that is due to the rising romanticization of depression. Current rhetoric about depression makes it sound as if depression is normal and unbeatable. Both of those claims are wrong. They are false. They need to be eradicated from the church and from our society in order to not only to save lives, but in order to save people for the rest of their lives from such a deep darkness from which they can be saved, but are being constrained there because of cultural scripts that tell them, well, you might as well just stay there because you can't get out and you're okay there anyway, aren't you? No, I'm not okay. I need to get out. Good. Have that mindset. You can get out. I went through a 5-year season of my life when I was severely depressed. And unfortunately, I went through that season while I was a research assistant at a biblical counseling center. And so there was a lot of antagonism there towards secular approaches to therapy. A lot of antagonism there toward that. And like many men, I considered suicide. 80% of suicides are male. And I never felt so alone in my life. I was a financially unstable adult. I was unmarried in a culture that really idolizes marriage. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's bad to want marriage and to have a culture that prizes and incentivizes marriage. It certainly is a good thing. But I was a financially unstable adult. I was unmarried. I was addicted to pornography. And I was slipping quickly into an alcohol addiction. And it was through discovering basic physical principles about diet and exercise that I was able to gain enough autonomy to stop telling myself these self-sabotaging scripts that were actually keeping me in a depressed situation. So I started my recovery from depression by taking one day. And I look back on this day and see this as a really pivoting day for myself. Okay, I started my recovery from depression by taking one day to fix all the things that could be fixed in a single day. You're not going to fix depression in a single day, but you could fix many things which contribute to a situational depression, and you could stop a cyclone from going further down. You can stop digging deeper in a single day. What did I do in that day? I did my laundry. That was huge. I folded my laundry. I got out of bed in the morning. I made a schedule for that day. I went for a run. It was like a mile or something like that, but I just sweat. I sweat. I joined a gym. I met with a friend and I asked him if we could get together regularly to kind of plan our schedules and think strategically about overcoming depressive situations and mindsets, and to set goals and to get some momentum, which included overcoming a chronic pornography addiction. And that single day that I took off to plan and to strategize and to join and to sharpen the axe is still paying off in my life to this day. And life isn't perfect, and I still have very bad days, but the difference is that now I have a lot of good days too. And when I was depressed, every day was hell. Every day was looking over a cliff. Every day was crushing, terrifying, dull, gray slop, and I thought it was going to go on forever. And now that's not true anymore. I'm happy. I'm happy. I'm married. I love my life. I still have bad days. I still have really bad days. But I have a lot of good days. I was able to find a wonderful wife. And my bad days affect her now more than they affect me. And now it's my responsibility to still continue to improve myself, not only for my sake, but for her sake and for our future children's sake. I'm still optimizing my life. I'm still climbing out of the hole. But when you start climbing out of depression, life gets a lot better. When you stop telling yourself that, well, it's normal and unbeatable and I should just not stigmatize myself and I should just be okay with it. I should just forgive myself. Forget forgiveness, man. The pill you need is self-improvement. It is getting better. It is climbing out of the hole one day at a time. Because when you climb out of the hole of depression, life gets a heck of a lot better. It really does. I promise you that. You can beat depression. I'm not saying I've beat depression. I'm saying I'm digging out. I'm digging out. And you can dig out too. And you ought to. That is your hope. That you can and ought to overcome your depression one day at a time, one step out of the hole at a time. And don't let any leftist progressive who fetishizes depression tell you, oh, don't worry about it. You can stay there. Don't stigmatize yourself. No. That is a self-sabotaging script. It sounds good. It sounds soothing. It sounds like, yeah, I should just forgive myself. You get to relax. You don't have to tense your muscles at all. You don't have to do anything. But they are handcuffs. They are shackles. It accomplishes exactly the opposite of what its speakers intend to do. You can beat depression. Despite what they say, you can beat depression. And you ought to. That is your hope.